Thank you all very much. So, firstly, why Garet Garrett? Well, thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm sure you all know a lot about economists. You all know about Rothbard. You all know about Mises. I thought Garet Garrett is one of my favourite authors, and little known even amongst libertarian circles, especially here in the UK. He's an American, and he's part of what was called the Old Right, the movement that seemed to fade away at the advent of the Second World War, to be replaced by the right we know it as today, the neoconservatives in America. Firstly, the anti-communist, the Cold War, both Republicans and Democrats in the States on the same side. So, as part of an inspiration to Rothbard and others developing the libertarian movement in the States, sort of in the 80s and beyond, I'll be quoting extensively from his work because I haven't written loads of stuff to talk about. So, and also from reviews and biographies of him. So, here's a quote from Jeffrey Tucker, just to start us off with, who said, Garet Garrett is a case study in a forgotten genius, about whom von Mises said, his keen penetration and his forceful direct language are unsurpassed by any author. Mises was speaking about the People's Pottage, a collection of three essays that linked the failures of the welfare and warfare states. But there is more to Garrett. Both his non-fiction and his novels display a rare talent. His entire work offers a sparkling vision of peace under free markets. Whereas many intellectuals regard the peaceful bourgeoisie society as a bore, with the middle class amassing wealth and spending it on fripperies, Garrett saw peace and freedom as the essential precondition for the real drama of human life that revolves around creation, association, risk, love, courage, and the full range of human experience that transforms society in spectacular ways. Garrett was born in 1878 in Illinois. He changed his name to Garrett. He was actually christened Edward, for some of you that asked me earlier, and he pronounces his name Garrett. Who knows why? That seems to be lost a bit in the in history. He moved to Chicago in 20 years old. Worked there for a couple of years on the Cleveland Recorder and the Washington Times. He moved to New York in 1900. Worked on the New York Sun, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He quit all that in about 1909, and he went on to start his career as a writer, starting with fiction. His fiction is fascinating. I'll go through some of his work fairly briefly. One called The Driver was his first big fiction, which is about a man with a passion for railroads, building up railroads from next to nothing. Bankrupt railroads, which was a big thing in the States in the 19th century. There's similarities here with Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. Some of you may have read that. This is a lighter read, shall we say. And to my mind, a better read as a work of fiction. You know, Ayn Rand obviously philosophically is in depth. She labours the point, shall we say. Here it's about relationships, about a man, his family and his relationships, and building up the railroad industry of the United States. The next famous one he wrote, the Cinder Buggy, is about the iron and steel industry, and the transformation of America from at the start of the book largely agricultural economy to an industrial economy. He deals with the period between 1820 and 1870 and the dramatic technological march Um, the, the plot concerns two industrialists. One is the hero who's beaten in the first generation, and the other is malevolent, but initially wins the first round of the competitive drive. The struggle continues throughout the generations, which leads to a titanic battle over whether steel or iron would triumph and why. This genre of fiction usually deals with real war. Garet Garrett, however, employs every literary device to make commerce itself the setting for great acts of courage, heroism, sacrifice and tragedy. And as with his other books, the central mover of events is the price system. This is the signal for and the cause of the changes in the plot. The reader discovers economics in a way that might otherwise not be possible, and it's hard to imagine that anyone would come away with anything but a love of the whole subject of enterprise. Garrett does not portray the market as an idealised utopia. Here we have the full range of human emotion and motivations at work: ignorance, pride, malice, love, compassion, jealousy, rage, and everything else. What it is that these emotions play themselves out in a setting that is ultimately peaceful. No one can control price movements, and it is these that act to reward virtue and punish vice. And a quick quote from the book, which is, I think, fantastic. A lot of history, as you know, is written about times of war, but this is a great example of a writing of what can happen under a laissez-fair economy. Now the steel age was come with its deluge of things. Man's environment was made over twice in one generation. Nothing was built but to be built again on a greater scale. It seemed impossible to make anything big enough. Wonders were a day's duration. In 25 years, the country's population had doubled. In the same time, the production of things unto the use, happiness and content of people increased 5, 10, 20-fold. Man has now in his hand the universal power of steel. It extended his arms and legs unimaginatively, grotesquely. That's his description of the power of market forces. Absolutely fantastic. My favourite fiction book is one called Satan's Bushel. This is about the agricultural side of things, set in the early 20th century. Fantastic characters. It's about gambling in wheat. It's also about growing wheat and about the relationship between the two. And it's about the war going on in Europe that's driving the price of wheat ever upward. He never sold, and all his profits were running wild. For the price knew not how to fall. He always bought, it always rose. A few weeks after Weaver's advent with the Board of Trade, America put her fist in the war. The price of wheat was then approaching $3 a bushel. The public cry against the pit increased, and not without reason in morals. For of course, if gamblers were manipulating the price of wheat for private greed, that was now both unpatriotic and abominable. Dreadwind spoke to Weaver. How could he reconcile what he was doing with any sense of common duty? The old man took thought and answered slowly, the pit cannot grow one blade of grass, neither can it destroy one grain of wheat. There is only so much wheat, no more, no less. It is only the price. That's my favourite book that Garrett wrote, and that's the one that actually inspired me to buy the whole lot on Mises.org. They've got a very special offer. Buy about 10 books for the price of about 8, and it saves on postage and packaging. So I recommend you all look at Mises.org. Also, following those fiction books, Garrett also wrote about economics. The Bubble That Broke the World is his most famous book on that subject. Very uncanny resemblances to what's been going on in the world in the last few years. This was written in the early 30s following the Wall Street crash. This is what he writes about that. Mass delusions are rare. They salt the human story. The hallucinatory types are well known. So also is a sudden variation called mania, generally located like the tulip mania in Holland. But many years ago, the common stock mania of a recent time in Wall Street, but a delusion affecting the mentality of the entire world at one time was hitherto unknown. All our experience with it is original. This is a delusion about credit, and whereon from this nature of credit is to be expected that a certain line will divide the view between creditor and debtor. The irrational fact in this case is that for more than 10 years debtors and creditors together have pursued the same deceptions. In many ways, as will appear, the folly of the lender has exceeded the extravagance of the borrower. The general shape of this universal delusion may be indicated by familiar features. That's profound, reading that back after many decades and looking at the current situation with the world, the state of debt. Quite uncanny similarities there. Garrett then went on to work for the Saturday Evening Post as leader writer. Primarily to start with, this was during the 30s, spoke out vehemently against the New Deals and the policies of Roosevelt. I was going to read a few of those, but we'll skip over that, and I'll just give you a quick quote of what he said about President Roosevelt. There had never been a president remotely like him. Power flourished in him and multiplied itself until he had more than any other president ever possessed or wanted. Some of it he got from a spellbound Congress, some of it he seized, some of it he got by outsmarting the law, and some of it by thinking of things no law had had the forethought to forbid. And yet, you could not say that he had an evil lust for power, like Lenin, Mussolini or Hitler. It sometimes seemed more as if he enormously enjoyed playing with it, just to see what would happen. He was not cruel, but perhaps he was too civilized to be sinister. But no constitution that had ever been written could tie this Roosevelt down. Very anti-New Deal. And he was very anti-war. He was very anti the war, and certainly from an American perspective. I think here in Britain we've sort of become accustomed to thinking the war, the Second World War was the right thing to do. We had to stand up to Hitler. Hitler was abominable. But thinking of it from an American perspective, should America have got into the war or not? What would have happened if they hadn't? Who knows? This is a part of an editorial. While there is still time to think, written in 1940. If we should come awake one morning to read in the newspaper headlines or hear by the radio that it had walked backwards into war, it would take no doubt as having been somewhat inevitable from the first, and yet nobody would be able to say quite how or why it happened. As the hagfish enters the body of its victims unawares and slowly replaces it by devouring it, so it is that ideas that were clear and virile in the beginning have been devoured by new meanings, with no change in the word shells, until now you may be called anti-American, a fifth communist or an appeaser if you doubt that the only way to keep America out of the war is to get into it, and that to save ourselves we have to first to save the British Empire, or that our first line of defence is, and always has been, the English Channel. The post position cannot be misunderstood. Before the Blitzkrieg started, we said, what we need is for practical security is a new word. The word is impregnability, or state of supreme defence. We need more than a bigger navy. We need two. One for the Atlantic and one for the Pacific, each incomparable. We need an impervious anti-aircraft wall. We need to be able to meet not only any aggressor, but any combination of aggressors. Then we may be sure that the principle of free institutions as a basis for modern civilization shall have, beyond the solace of words, a time yet to live in the world. And he goes on. there's more there about that perspective, which was largely forgotten. And when the war started, well, Garrett argued it started with the Lend-Lease programme in the March 1940. History books say it started with Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, Garrett was sacked from the papers. His work was quietly forgotten in an almost Orwellian kind of way. The whole old right movement was shifted to one side. He couldn't get any work. But at that stage, given that the country was at war, he was determined the country should win the war, and he actually went off into a shipyard and worked 10 hours a day building ships for the war effort. His most famous books, essays, are three essays together. Was called The Peoples Pottage. There's a new edition out now called Ex-America. The first essay of this is a scathing attack on the New Deal called The Revolution Was. It's a fantastic introduction to this. Which is actually on the back of my t-shirt as well. There are those who still think they are holding the pass against the revolution that may be coming up the road, but they are gazing in the wrong direction. The revolution is behind them. It went by in the night of depression, singing songs to freedom. There are those who have never ceased and very earnestly to say something is going to happen to the American form of government if we don't watch out. They were innocent dreamers. Their trust was in words. They had forgotten their Aristotle. More than 2,000 years ago he wrote of what can happen within the form when one thing takes the place of another, so that the ancient laws will remain while the power will be in the hands of those who have brought about a revolution within the state. The following one is Ex-America, and the last one of the sort of trio that really brought him what fame he did have is The Rise of Empire. And the first paragraph of this, just to give you a flavour of it, we have crossed the boundary that lies between republic and empire. When you ask when, the answer is that you cannot make a single stroke between day and night. The precise moment does not matter. There was no painted sign to say, you are now entering Imperium. Yet it was a very old road, and the voice of history was saying, whether you know it or not, the act of crossing may be irreversible, and now, not far ahead, is a sign that reads, no U-turns. That was his sort of seminal work, and that was why Mises and others sort of praised him so much. Those essays are very, very well worth reading, and you can get them online, I think, free of charge to download. Following on from that, later in his life, Garrett wrote another couple of books. One was a history of the Ford Motor Company, which in a way kind of parallels his fiction in praising free market enterprise, but obviously from a factual basis. He spoke with Henry Ford and got to know a bit about his life. This is the foreword to the book. Laissez-faire was a religion that grew to full size in the American environment and never anywhere else. It was founded on the doctrine of Adam Smith's unseen hand, the mysterious power which was to bring to pass that the individual, freely pursuing his selfish ends, was nevertheless bound to serve the common good, whether he intended to or not, or never thought about it at all. It was cruel in the way that nature is cruel to weak and marginal things, but it worked. How and why, naturally, it produced here the most fabulous material achievement in the history of the human race is the subject of many hefty and quarrelsome books in the library of social and economic theory. The idea of this book is to make you see it working through the eyes of its daring practitioner. If in this country, both for good and evil, free private enterprise had its logical manifestations in a prodigious manner, so Henry Ford was its extreme and last pure event. After him, it was all different. The religion declined. It no longer exists in the orthodox form anyway. But this is not a history of Ford and his times, nor a biography either furnished with notes, conclusions and meaning. Rather, it is a structure of episode, word and deed like a dwelling, and the man is there, a kind of divine mechanic, the ultimate child of his era, acting upon his world with ruthless and terrible energy by instinct and intuition, who thought with his hands. As you are watching him coming in and going out, you may not understand him. Indeed, it is probable he did not understand himself. But if you will perhaps get some feeling of life and its lusty transactions under the creed of laissez-faire, and therefore arrive at a judgment of your own concerning what we have left behind. And the footnote here, his feelings for people were those of a shy, sensitive, egotistical man, but his feelings for the machine was an original passion. One may believe that he was the first to see what the machine was for. The right to use it was not simply to increase the leverage of man's animal power so that he might perform his work with less exertion. No. But if you learned its inexhaustible laws and obeyed them with the machine, would transform society in a wonderful manner. Set it free from immemorial and wasteful drudginess. Fill its life with new and miraculous things, and give us a time to enjoy them. A world that could never be made with hands. That's the Wild Wheel. I think I'm running low on time, but the last one, and this is actually published after his death, is a fantastic book. It's a bit crumpled here. I've read it many times. Is A History of America from Columbus until about 1952, 53, just before Garrett died. It's written in a fantastic style, similar to the others you've heard. Interesting discussions. I don't know if any of you have seen the film Lincoln about the Civil War, or as libertarians would say, the war between the states, maybe a more accurate,
or subjugation,
or whatever.
The war to suppress Southern secession.
That was the one. Yes, he called it the Civil War, but I no doubt you know the Lincoln myth that Lincoln was a great hero that invaded the South to end slavery isn't quite the whole story. It's complicated, but Garrett really distills it down to its essence, complexities and all. Our most tragic historical possession is the Civil War. As the event recedes in time, it comes to have had the kind of otherwhere reality that belongs to an epic poem, in which people are moved beyond themselves by forces they can only pretend to understand. Yet, we wrote it ourselves. That is, unless history too is fiction. Only those who make it true by enacting it do not invent it. If we wrote it, we made it up as we went along. What happened was unwilled and unwanted. Therefore, it must have been inevitable, if we know what that means. On rhetoric and reasoning, there was an outpour in the like of which had never occurred since, and neither one nor the other had anything to do with it. Both collapsed and magnificently futility because, for one thing, all the premises were in quicksand. It was that debacle of human wisdom which makes it necessary that the issue, whatever it is, shall be decided in the evening of battle. Killing is the unanswerable argument. Afterward, it might turn out that neither side knew for sure what it was fighting for. Then, all that was ugly, indecent, treacherous and base will be dismissed, as of course, and all that was brave, heroic, generous and grand will be celebrated with festival, pageantry and monuments of glory, so that life may go on again in a tolerable manner. That's about the Civil War. As I say, this covers the whole of American history, so it's a very good quick read if you want to an update. But one thing I think I'll just finish off with is again about the great period in American history, the period of laissez-faire, which isn't much written about, particularly between the end of the war between the states, between 1865 and sort of the 1900, how America developed and how absolutely remarkable that development was. The European system was bankrupt, though few could believe it. The system whereby Europe exchanged her dear manufactured goods for the cheap food and raw materials largely produced by the drudge of labour of the world. The sign of paramount power that had stood over Europe like a star for more than 2,000 years had already crossed the Atlantic to stand over us. One generation of Americans, with their fierce jealousy for freedom of enterprise and their philosophy of laissez-faire, had created here the most powerful industrial nation on earth. It was not what they possessed in land and treasure and knowledge. Other people had as much of these or more. It is what they did with what they had, and they were bound to go on until they should have in their hands, of their own making, half the industrial power of the world, and no rational idea with what to do with it. That was Garet's last book, as I say, published just before he died. So I commend Garet to all of you, and just to finish off, there was one last thing, which was written by Jeffrey Tucker. He just says, to Garet, there is no heroism in statism, but only in creativity and production, and no folly greater than overthrowing the institutions that make creativity and economic progress possible. He was not just a great writer of fiction, not just a courageous opponent of the planning state and war. He was a prophet of the fate of America under government control, a brilliant intellectual force in the 20th century, and a wise and eloquent spokesman for freedom itself. Thank you.